The old recording studio sat at the end of a quiet Nashville street, hidden behind tall oak trees that had watched generations of musicians come and go. It wasn't one of the glamorous studios where gold records lined every wall or where reporters crowded outside the entrance. This place was different. It was smaller, older, almost forgotten. Inside, the wooden floors creaked with every step. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight that slipped between half-closed curtains. Vintage microphones stood like silent guardians, and faded photographs of legendary recording sessions covered the walls. On a warm afternoon in July 1977, the studio felt unusually quiet. The owner had canceled every appointment. No musicians, no reporters, no photographers. Only one recording session remained on the schedule. A simple handwritten note rested beside the mixing console. 3 p.m., Elvis Presley, private session. No one expected history to walk through that door, not even the people waiting inside. Tom Bradley adjusted one of the old microphones for what felt like the 100th time. At 38 years old, Tom wasn't famous. He wasn't a producer. He wasn't a songwriter. He wasn't even a recording engineer. Officially, he was just the studio's maintenance technician. His job was simple: repair microphones, replace cables, tune instruments, make sure everything worked before the real professionals arrived. Most artists never even learned his name. That was perfectly fine with him. Tom loved music more than attention. He believed the greatest moments often happened when nobody noticed. That belief would change his life forever. The studio owner, Frank Collins, walked slowly into the recording room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You nervous?" Frank asked. Tom smiled. "Not really." Frank laughed softly. "You're about to spend the afternoon with Elvis Presley." Tom shrugged. "I've fixed microphones for famous people before." Frank looked directly at him. "No," he paused. "You've fixed microphones. This is Elvis." The room became silent again. Even saying the name felt different. Elvis. One word. No explanation needed. The man who had changed popular music forever. The voice that had filled stadiums. The face recognized around the world. The king. 3 o'clock came. Nothing. 3:15. Still nothing. Frank checked his watch every few minutes. Tom quietly polished the chrome stand holding the studio's oldest microphone. By 3:30, both men had stopped talking. Maybe he wasn't coming. Then, a black Cadillac slowly rolled into the parking lot. Neither man rushed to the window. They simply watched. The driver's door opened first. Then another man stepped out. Finally, the back door opened. Elvis Presley climbed out. For a brief second, Tom forgot how to breathe. He had seen Elvis on television, on magazine covers, in movies, on stage before thousands. But seeing him in person felt strangely different. There was no screaming audience, no bright lights, no security rushing people away. Just one man standing quietly beneath the afternoon sun. He looked older than the photographs, more tired. His shoulders carried an invisible weight. Yet something about him remained unmistakable. The way he walked, the calm confidence, the quiet kindness in his eyes. Even before he smiled, everyone knew exactly who he was. The studio door opened. Frank stepped forward first. "Good afternoon, Elvis." Elvis smiled warmly. "Afternoon, Frank." His voice sounded softer than Tom expected, less like a superstar, more like an old friend visiting someone's house. Frank introduced Tom. "This is Tom. He keeps this old place alive." Elvis extended his hand immediately. "Nice to meet you, Tom." Tom shook it. His hands were rough from years of repairing equipment. Elvis didn't seem to notice. Instead, he smiled. "I hear you're the reason these old microphones still work." Tom laughed nervously. "I do my best." Elvis looked around the room. "I like places like this." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You've recorded in the biggest studios in America." Elvis nodded. "Exactly." He gently touched the wooden piano. "They're beautiful. But they don't always feel honest." Tom quietly remembered those words. He would repeat them years later. There was no large recording crew, only Frank behind the console, Tom checking equipment, and Elvis sitting alone with an acoustic guitar resting across his knee. No orchestra, no backup singers, no flashy arrangements. Just wood, strings, one microphone, one chair, one man. The silence inside the room felt sacred. Before they began, Frank asked an ordinary question. "So, what are we recording today?" Elvis looked down at his guitar. For several long seconds he said nothing. Finally, he smiled. "I don't know." Both men looked confused. Elvis continued. "I've spent my whole life singing songs people expected me to sing." He slowly tuned one guitar string. "Today, I'd rather sing the ones I've been carrying inside me." Frank nodded. No pressure. No deadlines. No record label. Elvis smiled. "That's exactly why I'm here." Tom quietly stepped back toward the control room. His job was finished. Everything worked perfectly. Normally, he would have left. Instead, something told him to stay. Not because Elvis was famous, because the room felt different, almost important. He couldn't explain it. Years later, he still couldn't. Elvis adjusted the microphone slightly lower. He closed his eyes. His fingers rested on the guitar strings, but he didn't play. Instead, he whispered something so quietly that only Tom heard it. "I hope Mama can hear this." Tom froze. He wasn't sure if anyone else had noticed. Frank was already preparing the recording machine. The tape reels slowly began turning. Their gentle mechanical sound filled the room. Click, whir, click. Recording had begun. Elvis still hadn't played a single note. Instead, he stared across the room toward the large studio window. Outside, the summer breeze gently moved the tree branches. Birds landed on the fence before flying away again. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Finally, Elvis spoke again. "You know, I used to think success meant hearing thousands of people cheering." He smiled sadly. "But lately, I think success is finding one quiet room where you can hear yourself." Nobody answered. There was nothing to say. His fingers brushed the guitar strings. One simple chord echoed through the room. Then another. No performance, no dramatic introduction, just music. Pure, gentle, honest. Tom had heard countless musicians rehearse before. This sounded different. Every note seemed less concerned with perfection and more concerned with truth. Halfway through the melody, Elvis suddenly stopped. He looked embarrassed. "I forgot part of it." Frank leaned toward the microphone. "We can start over." Elvis slowly shook his head. "No," he smiled. "Leave that in." Frank looked surprised. "You want the mistake?" Elvis nodded. "It isn't a mistake. It's proof someone real was sitting here." Tom felt goosebumps spread across his arms. He had repaired thousands of microphones, yet he had never heard anyone say something like that. The afternoon continued quietly. Between songs, Elvis spoke about childhood memories in Tupelo, about learning music inside church, about sitting beside his mother while she sang old gospel hymns, not as a celebrity giving an interview, simply as a son remembering home. Tom noticed something strange. Whenever Elvis talked about fame, his shoulders became heavier. Whenever he talked about family, his eyes became brighter. It was as if two different versions of the same man lived inside him. One belonged to the world. The other still belonged to a small Mississippi church where music had first taught him hope. Hours passed, almost unnoticed. No one looked at the clock anymore. Outside, golden sunlight slowly faded into the warm colors of early evening. Inside the studio, something extraordinary was happening. Not because Elvis was trying to create another hit, but because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply telling the truth through every note he played. Tom didn't realize it then, but years later, when people asked him what he had witnessed that afternoon, he would always give the same answer. "It wasn't the greatest performance I ever heard." He would pause before continuing. "It was the most honest." And before that unforgettable evening was over, something would happen inside that quiet room that none of them could ever forget. The room remained completely silent after Elvis finished the final chord of the first song. Nobody moved, not Frank, not Tom. Even the old tape machine seemed to hum more quietly, as if it understood that interrupting the moment would be disrespectful. Elvis slowly lifted his hands from the guitar. He didn't ask the question every performer usually asked, "How was it?" Instead, he looked toward the window, almost as though he wasn't interested in hearing anyone else's opinion. Frank finally pressed the stop button. The tape reels slowed until they came to a complete stop. The silence that followed somehow felt even louder than the music itself. Finally, Frank smiled. "I've recorded hundreds of singers." He leaned back in his chair. "But I've never heard anyone sing like they had absolutely nothing left to prove." Elvis looked down and chuckled. "That's because I don't." Tom walked into the recording room carrying 3 cups of fresh coffee. He placed one beside Elvis without saying a word. Elvis nodded politely. "Thank you." Tom smiled. "You look different than I expected." Frank immediately laughed. "You can't say that to Elvis." But Elvis only grinned. "No, let him finish." Tom hesitated. "I thought I'd meet the king." He looked around the empty room. "But I think I met a man." For several seconds, Elvis didn't answer. Then he quietly whispered, "I've been trying to find that man again." Outside, rain clouds slowly gathered over Nashville. Soft thunder rolled somewhere far away. The sunlight faded into gray. Inside the studio, the atmosphere became even more intimate. Frank adjusted another microphone. "So, what's next?" Elvis gently rubbed the worn body of his guitar. "There was a song my mother used to sing." Frank waited. "I've never recorded it." Tom looked up. "Why not?" Elvis smiled sadly. "Because every time I tried, I couldn't get through it." No one spoke after that. Frank simply rewound the tape. The reels spun backward with a mechanical whir. Click, 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 ready, recording. Again. Elvis closed his eyes. His fingers touched the strings. But instead of playing immediately, he began talking. "You know, when people think about my life, they remember the crowds, the movies, the cars, the houses, the concerts. He paused. But none of those things made me who I am. He slowly looked toward the ceiling. My mother did. Tom had never heard Elvis speak so openly. This wasn't an interview. There were no television cameras, no magazine reporters, no publicity manager telling him what to say. Just 4 walls, 1 microphone, 3 men, and the truth. Elvis finally began playing. The melody was slow, gentle, almost like a prayer. His voice wasn't as powerful as it had been years before. Age, exhaustion, endless touring, years of pressure, everything had left its mark. Yet somehow, those imperfections made every word sound even more believable. Tom felt something he had never experienced before. He wasn't listening to a superstar. He was listening to someone's soul. Halfway through the song, Elvis stopped singing. His voice cracked. Not because he missed a note, because emotion had taken over. He looked away from the microphone. I'm sorry. Frank reached toward the talkback button. We can edit that. Elvis shook his head immediately. No. He swallowed hard. Don't erase it. Frank looked confused. It wasn't perfect. Elvis smiled. Exactly. Tom suddenly understood something. For years, millions of people had expected Elvis Presley to sound perfect. But sitting in that room, Elvis wasn't searching for perfection anymore. He was searching for honesty. The second take began. This time, Elvis finished the song. When the final chord faded, Tom noticed tears resting quietly in the corners of Elvis's eyes. Elvis quickly wiped them away before anyone could pretend not to notice. Frank stood up. I'm going to step outside for a minute. He wasn't going outside. He simply wanted to give Elvis a little privacy. Tom understood. He quietly followed Frank into the hallway. The hallway smelled of old wood and magnetic recording tape. Neither man spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Frank broke the silence. He's tired. Tom nodded. No. He looked back toward the recording room. He's carrying something. Frank slowly exhaled. I've known Elvis for years. He always carried something. Tom leaned against the wall. You think he knows? Frank looked at him. Knows what? Tom searched for the right words. That this feels... He stopped. Frank finished the sentence. Different? Tom nodded. Frank looked toward the closed studio door. I think he does. Inside the room, Elvis remained completely alone. The guitar rested across his knees. He stared at an old family photograph sitting on the piano. Someone had left it there years ago. A young boy, his parents, a tiny wooden house. It reminded him of Tupelo. For several minutes, he simply stared. No music, no talking, just memories. When Frank and Tom returned, they found Elvis smiling. I think I found the last song. Frank looked surprised. You weren't planning one? Elvis slowly shook his head. No, but this room reminded me. What song? Tom asked. Elvis looked at both men. You've probably never heard it. Frank smiled. Try us. Elvis softly laughed. It isn't famous. It isn't even finished. Tom frowned. You wrote it? Elvis nodded. Years ago. I never let anyone hear it. Frank's eyes widened. Why? Elvis took a deep breath. Because it wasn't for the audience. It was for me. Those words hung in the room. Tom suddenly felt as though he shouldn't even be there. This wasn't just another recording session anymore. It felt like someone opening pages of a diary that had never been read. The tape machine rolled once again. Elvis adjusted the microphone one final time. Then he surprised everyone. Instead of sitting, he stood, holding the guitar tightly against his chest. He closed his eyes. The first chord echoed through the room, then another. The melody sounded unlike anything Tom had heard all afternoon. It wasn't country. It wasn't rock and roll. It wasn't gospel. It somehow carried pieces of all three, as though every chapter of Elvis's life had come together inside a single song. The lyrics spoke about home, about forgiveness, about searching for peace after spending a lifetime chasing applause. Every word felt painfully personal. Tom forgot he was supposed to be watching the equipment. Frank forgot to take notes. Neither man moved. Neither man even blinked. As the final verse approached, Elvis's voice grew softer, almost fragile. Then, silence. Not because the song had ended, because Elvis had stopped singing. He looked down at the guitar. His hands trembled. Very gently, he whispered into the microphone, "I finally understand." Frank instinctively reached toward the stop button, but Tom quietly grabbed his wrist. "Wait!" Frank looked confused. Tom whispered, "Keep recording." For nearly 30 seconds, no one spoke. The tape continued rolling, capturing every breath, every quiet sound inside the room, the distant thunder outside, the old wooden floor settling beneath their feet. And one man, sitting silently in front of a microphone, as though saying goodbye to something only he could see. None of them realized it then, but years later, music historians would call those 30 silent seconds the most haunting part of the entire recording. Because sometimes, silence tells a story that no song ever can. And before the night was over, Tom Bradley would witness something so unexpected that he would spend the rest of his life wondering whether he had just watched the end of an era, or the beginning of a legend that would outlive time itself. The tape continued to spin. No one reached for the stop button. The silence that followed Elvis's unfinished sentence felt heavier than any applause Tom had ever heard. "I finally understand." Those 4 words lingered in the room long after they had been spoken. Frank slowly lowered his hand from the recording console. He looked toward Tom. Tom simply shook his head. "Don't interrupt. Not yet." Sometimes the most important part of a recording wasn't the music. It was everything that happened after it. Nearly a full minute passed. Finally, Elvis opened his eyes. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like a man who had just spent years carrying an invisible burden and had finally set it down. He smiled weakly. "I guess that wasn't exactly radio material." Frank laughed softly. "No. It was something much better." Elvis tilted his head. "What?" Frank answered without hesitation. "The truth." For the first time that afternoon, Elvis laughed from his heart. A genuine laugh. Not the polished smile fans had seen in interviews, not the charming grin from Hollywood films. This laugh belonged to the young boy who had once dreamed of making music because he loved it. Tom noticed something extraordinary. The lines of stress around Elvis's face seemed lighter. Only for a moment, but they were lighter. Frank rewound the tape. "Would you like to hear it back?" Most artists always said yes. Elvis surprised them. "No." Tom looked confused. "You don't want to hear it?" Elvis gently rested the guitar against the chair. "If I listen now, I'll start fixing things. I'll sing another note. I'll change a word. I'll chase perfection again." He smiled. "I've spent enough years doing that." Tom had repaired studio equipment for almost 20 years. He had worked with perfectionists, artists who demanded 30 takes, 40 takes, sometimes 100. Yet here sat the most famous singer in the world, choosing to leave his flaws untouched. Outside, rain finally began falling. Large drops struck the studio windows. The sound blended beautifully with the quiet hum of the tape machine. Nobody spoke. Everyone simply listened. Rain. Tape. Breathing. The room itself had become part of the recording. Elvis stood and slowly walked toward the large window. He watched the rain for several minutes. Without turning around, he asked, "Tom?" Tom looked surprised. "Yes, sir?" Elvis smiled. "You don't have to call me sir." Tom laughed awkwardly. "Sorry." Elvis nodded toward the rain. "Tell me something. What made you stay today?" Tom wasn't expecting the question. "I almost left." Elvis turned around. "But you didn't." Tom thought carefully before answering. "I've worked in recording studios for years. I know when someone is singing." He paused. "And I know when someone is saying goodbye." The room fell completely silent. Frank slowly looked away. Even he hadn't expected those words. Elvis stared at Tom for several long seconds. Instead of looking offended, he smiled. "Aren't you observant?" Tom immediately felt embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." Elvis raised his hand. "No. You noticed. Most people don't." He returned to his chair. His voice became quieter. "Do you know what the hardest part of being famous is?" Neither Frank nor Tom answered. Elvis continued. "Everyone remembers who they think you were. They stop seeing who you've become." He looked at the guitar resting beside him. "They still see the young man shaking his hips on television. They still hear the records from 20 years ago. They still expect me to be that person." He gently smiled. "But people grow older. They get tired. They lose people they love. They make mistakes. They wonder if they mattered." His voice almost disappeared. "And sometimes they simply want peace." Tom felt chills run down his arms. He realized something heartbreaking. Millions of fans adored Elvis Presley. Yet very few people had probably asked him how he actually felt. Frank quietly changed the subject. "Would you like some dinner?" Elvis chuckled. "Now that's the best offer I've heard all day." An hour later, the three men sat around a small wooden table inside the studio lounge. No luxury catering, no expensive restaurant, just hamburgers, French fries, coffee, and homemade apple pie that Frank's wife had baked that morning. Tom couldn't believe what he was seeing. The king of rock and roll, laughing over burned French fries, telling childhood stories, asking ordinary questions. There were moments when Tom completely forgot he was sitting beside one of the most famous people on earth. Elvis noticed an old guitar hanging on the lounge wall. Its finish was badly worn. The strings looked ancient. He pointed toward it. "Does anyone still play that?" Frank laughed. "No, it barely stays in tune." Elvis stood up. "Mind if I try?" Frank handed it to him. The guitar squeaked as Elvis adjusted it. He strummed one chord, then another. "It isn't broken," he smiled. "It just needs someone to believe it's still worth playing." Tom quietly looked down at his coffee. For some reason, that sentence felt like it wasn't about the guitar at all. The evening slowly turned into night. Rain continued falling outside. Thunder echoed farther away now. Frank glanced at the clock. "We've recorded more than enough today." Elvis nodded. I know. But he made no effort to leave. Instead, he walked back into the recording room. Tom and Frank followed. The microphone still stood exactly where Elvis had left it. The tape machine sat waiting. Its reels were empty now. Elvis gently placed one hand on the microphone. You know, this microphone has probably heard thousands of songs. Tom smiled. More than we could count. Elvis looked at him. But every singer leaves something behind. Tom frowned. What do you mean? Elvis tapped the microphone lightly. Not their voice. Their heart. Frank reached into a cabinet and removed a brand new reel of recording tape. I've got enough tape for one more song. Elvis smiled. I don't think I have another song. Frank shrugged. Then don't sing. Elvis laughed. You just want to use the tape. Frank grinned. It expires next month. The three men laughed together. The tension disappeared. For just a few minutes, there was no celebrity, no technician, no studio owner, only three friends sharing a quiet evening. Then something unexpected happened. A loud crack of thunder shook the building. For a split second, the studio lights flickered. The tape machine stopped. Everything went dark. Silence. Only the sound of rain remained. Tom immediately grabbed a flashlight. I'll check the breaker. He hurried downstairs. The basement was cold and damp. After a few minutes he found the problem. One old fuse had blown. He replaced it. Moments later, the lights returned. When Tom walked back upstairs, he stopped in the doorway. Elvis was standing alone in the recording room. No microphone, no guitar, no audience. He thought nobody was watching. Very quietly, almost in a whisper, Elvis was singing an old gospel hymn to himself. No performance, no recording, just faith, just memory, just one lonely voice filling an empty room. Tom instinctively froze. He didn't want to interrupt. The song echoed through the studio with a sincerity unlike anything he had heard all day. When Elvis finished, he slowly turned around. Their eyes met. For a second, neither man spoke. Then Elvis smiled. You weren't supposed to hear that. Tom smiled back. I think I was. Elvis looked at him thoughtfully. Maybe. He walked over and placed a gentle hand on Tom's shoulder. If people remember me, I hope they remember moments like this, Tom answered honestly. They won't. Elvis looked surprised. They'll remember something even greater. Elvis raised an eyebrow. What's that? Tom smiled. They'll remember how you made them feel. For the first time that day, Elvis's eyes filled with tears he didn't even try to hide. He nodded once, without saying another word. Neither of them realized that only weeks later the world would lose Elvis Presley. But the quiet conversation shared in that little Nashville studio would remain locked inside Tom Bradley's memory for decades, until one unexpected discovery would bring that forgotten night back into the light and change how millions of people remembered Elvis forever. 3 weeks later. The telephone rang just after sunrise. Tom Bradley had barely poured his first cup of coffee when he answered it. Hello? For several seconds, no one spoke. Then he heard Frank's voice. Only 2 words. He's gone. Tom frowned. What? Frank struggled to continue. Elvis passed away this morning. The coffee cup slipped from Tom's hand. It shattered across the kitchen floor. He didn't even notice. Everything around him suddenly became distant. The room, the sunlight, the ticking clock. It all disappeared beneath the weight of those 2 words. He's gone. For the next several days, the world seemed to stop. Every radio station interrupted its programming. Television anchors fought back tears as they announced the news. Thousands of fans gathered outside Graceland. Some prayed, some cried, some simply stood in silence, unable to believe the man whose voice had shaped an entire generation was no longer alive. Tom watched the coverage from his small apartment. But unlike millions of others, he couldn't stop thinking about one particular evening. Not the concerts, not the movies, not the screaming crowds. Only that quiet studio, that old wooden chair, the rain tapping against the windows, and Elvis whispering, "I finally understand." A week later, Frank called again. "Can you come to the studio?" Tom arrived before sunset. The building looked exactly the same cracked front steps, the same faded sign, the same oak trees swaying gently in the wind. Yet everything felt different, as though the building itself knew someone extraordinary would never walk through its doors again. Frank was already waiting inside. He held a small cardboard box. Without saying a word, he placed it on the recording console. Inside were the tapes from that final session. Tom stared at them. 4 simple reels. Nothing about them looked valuable. No gold labels, no official logos, just handwritten notes. Private session. July 1977. Frank sighed. "I've been thinking." Tom looked up. "What do we do with them?" Neither man answered, because neither knew. Over the following months, several record companies contacted Frank. Some had heard rumors that Elvis had recorded something shortly before his death. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. "Do you have unreleased songs?" Frank always gave the same answer. No. Technically, he wasn't lying. Those recordings had never been intended as commercial releases. They weren't made for an album. They weren't polished. They weren't finished. They were simply one man's conversation with music. And Frank believed some conversations deserved privacy. Years passed. Music changed. New stars arrived. Old legends faded. Cassette tapes replaced vinyl. Compact discs replaced cassettes. Then digital music arrived. The world moved forward. Tom continued repairing microphones. Frank eventually retired. The little Nashville studio closed its doors. Dust slowly settled over the empty recording room where Elvis had spent that unforgettable afternoon. The tapes remained locked inside a fireproof cabinet. Almost forgotten. 28 years later. Tom was 66 years old. His hair had turned completely gray. His hands still carried tiny scars from decades of repairing studio equipment. One rainy afternoon, he received another unexpected phone call. A young documentary filmmaker wanted to interview people who had worked behind the scenes during Elvis Presley's career. Tom almost declined. He had never enjoyed cameras. But something inside him whispered, "It's time." The interview took place inside the abandoned studio itself. Nothing had changed. The old microphone still stood in the corner. The wooden chair remained exactly where Elvis had left it. Even the piano still carried the scratches made by countless musicians over the decades. The interviewer asked ordinary questions. What was Elvis like? Was he funny? Was he professional? Tom answered politely. Then came one final question. Did you ever witness a moment that people don't know about? Tom became completely silent. For nearly 30 seconds. He didn't say a word. Finally, he smiled. I've spent almost 30 years protecting someone's final conversation. The interviewer leaned forward. What conversation? Tom looked toward the empty recording room, the one he had with himself. The cameras stopped rolling. Tom walked to the old storage cabinet. His hands trembled as he searched through dusty boxes. Then he found them. 4 aging tape reels, exactly where Frank had left them decades earlier. The labels had faded. The cardboard smelled of old paper and magnetic tape. Tom gently lifted one reel into the light. For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. The tapes were carefully restored by audio preservation specialists. Every second was transferred into modern digital format. The engineers expected damaged recordings. Instead, they discovered something remarkable. The tapes weren't technically perfect. There were breathing sounds, chair movements, rain striking the windows, long moments of silence, tiny imperfections, exactly as Elvis had wanted. Nothing had been erased. Nothing had been corrected. When the recordings were finally played publicly for a small audience of musicians, historians, and longtime fans, no one applauded after the first song. Not because they disliked it, because many of them were crying. They weren't hearing Elvis Presley, the icon. They were hearing Elvis Presley, the man, the father, the son, the believer, the friend, the human being hidden behind decades of fame. One elderly woman quietly whispered, "I've listened to Elvis for 50 years, and today is the first time I truly met him." News of the recordings spread quickly. Newspapers called them the most intimate recordings Elvis ever made. Music historians describe them as a rare glimpse behind the legend. Fans around the world listened with tears in their eyes. Many noticed something unusual. Their favorite moments weren't the songs, they were the pauses between them. The quiet laughter, the stories about his mother, the soft prayers, the honest conversations, the silence. For the first time, people understood why Tom had protected those tapes for so many years. A young reporter eventually asked Tom, "What made those recordings so special?" Tom smiled. "It wasn't because Elvis sang perfectly. It was because he finally stopped trying to." The reporter looked puzzled. Tom continued, "People spend their whole lives chasing perfection. But perfection doesn't make us feel connected. Honesty does." Several months later, Tom returned to the abandoned studio one final time. The building was scheduled to be demolished. Developers planned to replace it with modern offices. He slowly walked into the recording room. The microphone was gone. The piano had been removed. Only the empty wooden floor remained. Rain began falling outside, just as it had on that unforgettable afternoon. Tom closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he could almost hear Elvis again, not performing, not entertaining, simply singing. The same quiet hymn, the same gentle voice, the same peaceful smile. Tom whispered into the empty room, "You were right." The room answered only with silence. He smiled. No one remembers perfection. They remember truth. As Tom turned to leave, he noticed something lying beneath the old chair that had somehow survived every cleanup over the years. It was a small guitar pick, white, worn smooth around the edges. On one side, faded almost beyond recognition, were the letters E.P. Tom picked it up carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Not as a souvenir, as a reminder. Some legends are built by sold-out arenas. Others are born in a quiet room, with no audience, no cameras, no applause, just one man, one microphone, and one silent witness who understood that the greatest performance of Elvis Presley's life was never meant to prove he was the king of rock and roll. It was meant to remind the world that before he was a legend, he was simply a human being searching for peace. And perhaps that is why the final recording session was never truly about music. It was about courage. The courage to let the world hear not the strongest voice, but the most honest one. Because in the end, records can be broken, fame can fade, crowds eventually go home, but a single moment of genuine truth can echo through history forever.